Okay, the first thing I want to do is I want to welcome everyone to tonight's Wildlife for You webinar. It's titled Beavers, Nature's Ecological Engineers. And there's going to be two instructors for tonight's presentation, myself, Daryl Radijak, and you also see here on the video Stephanie Dennis. We're both wildlife biologists. We have our degree in wildlife biology. Don't want to say we're really big time beaver specialists. We know a little bit about beavers. We've been taught some things, some really interesting things that we hope to share with you today. So I just designated us as part-time beaver specialists. Primarily, both of us do serve as large carnivore specialists, and so if you have any beaver attack type of questions, we'd be happy to answer those. But we should be able to teach you something really interesting about beavers today. They're truly, truly wonderful animals. So to get things started with each and every presentation, what I like to do is go over the wildlife experience that the instructors have, because I want the students to have confidence that they're getting information from someone that should know what they're talking about, and they're not just listening to someone who gets out there and just tells their opinion. So what you're going to hear tonight from myself and from Stephanie is going to be science-based information. All of our Wildlife for You webinars are based on the latest, most up-to-date science. We call it the best available scientific information. And so I'm one of the instructors. Again, my name's Daryl Radijak. Most of you know me. I do have a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental and Forest Biology from the State University of New York, College of Environmental Science and Forestry. I already lied to you because I coughed again. Got my degree way back in 1992, which kind of tells you how very, very old I am. But after I got my degree, one of the first jobs I had was I was selected as the manager of the Appalachian Bear Center, which is just outside of Great Smoky Mountain National Park. That's where I fell in love with bears. The National Park Service, the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, used to bring me orphan bear cubs, and we would rehabilitate them, release them back to the wild. There's also bear education, there's also bear research. Did that for about 5 years, and then I bumped up to begin working for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. And because of my bear experience, I was soon promoted to the big game coordinator position for the state of Tennessee. And so I was over the bear program, the deer program, the elk, even the wild hog program. Did that for about 7 years. So instead of handling individual bears, I was now dealing with bear populations. But I was also dealing with a whole lot of other wildlife. For some reason or another, the executive director saw something in me and he promoted me to the chief of wildlife for the state of Tennessee. Did that for another 5 years. That was an awesome job. I was wearing suits, going to commission meetings, just going to conferences left and right. No longer in the field, no longer really talking to the public as much as I would like to. And then I was often told what I had to say to the public. So anyway, I made the jump. Always loved the Rockies, wanted to live and work in the Rockies. So about 3 years ago, I made the jump and moved to New Mexico. And I'm a wildlife biologist by day, but a wildlife educator by night. And that's why I started this business. So enough about me. Let me introduce Stephanie Dennis, and she can tell you a little bit about her background.
Yeah, so my name, again, I'm Stephanie Dennis. I got my bachelor's from Oregon State University, who ironically are the Beavers. So I'm specifically prepared for tonight's course. Thank you, Mr. Radijak. Um, my specialization is in apex predator human wildlife dynamics, which is actually the very first of its kind. I worked with the college to actually kind of create that. The primary focus that I have, unlike Daryl, is not so much working in the field, though I do that if I have an opportunity to, but I actually work more so with federal, provincial, and state wildlife professionals. Usually these are with the federal agencies or the state agencies. And we do a training that we call the Wildlife Human Attack Response Training. The acronym is WART, which is the worst acronym ever, but it is what it is. And in that, we actually train all of the agency staff to be able to respond to the severe or fatal wildlife incidents, like if there's a bear attack, cougar attack. I admit I don't think we responded to the beaver attack that Daryl mentioned, but generally speaking, we go out and we figure out what happened, and we do our best to try to identify the actual specific offending animal so that we're not out there needlessly killing wildlife that may not have been involved and are just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I've been a backpacker and an outdoorsman for my entire life. But again, I'm like Daryl, the passion really exists for a lot of those apex predators.
Okay, now that you know a little bit about us, let's jump into tonight's topic. So we're going to be talking for the next 45 minutes or so about the North American beaver. And what we're going to do, we're going to divide this up into two different topics here. I'm going to lead off, talk probably 15, 20 minutes about the North American beaver, the biology of North American beaver. And then I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie. Stephanie has a really great understanding of the ecological impacts that beavers bring in. One of the things that she studied quite a bit while at Oregon State was this idea of keystone species and trophic cascades, and beavers are such a great example of a really critical species that really has a tremendous impact on the ecology of the landscape. And so I'll turn it over to Stephanie and she can take it from there. But for the most part, I'm going to teach you about the critter itself. So North American beaver, Castor canadensis, using the Linnaean terms. And I don't want to get too sciencey on you, but we are going to teach you a few things, hopefully. But I'm not going to be talking about Jerry Mathers. We're not going to be talking about this North American beaver. We're going to be talking about a different one that is in the family, or it's in the order, again, the Linnaean term, Rodentia, which, if you remember your elementary, your high school science classes where you have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, all that other fun stuff, the order is Rodentia. And that order, that big, giant grouping of animals, comes from the Latin term. The Latin term is rodere, but it means to gnaw. And so this is a huge group of animals that are in this order Rodentia. And just to let you know how big this group is, just under half of all the mammals that exist that we know of are listed in this order. And so when you're thinking about this order, think of those little critters think of rodents. So animals like mice and rats, they all belong to Rodentia. Chipmunks and squirrels and prairie dogs. And my favorite, sometimes you don't always get the best pictures you want, so you got to grab what you can. You have woodchucks there and porcupines, and tell me that woodchuck and porcupine don't look like mortal enemies there, but they also belong to the order Rodentia. And then you have the beaver, which is the second largest mammal within this order. I'm going to quiz you. Let's see how smart you guys out there. No instructors can respond. But within this order Rodentia, the beaver is the second largest animal in there. Does anyone know what the largest mammal there is in the order Rodentia? Surely if you type nutria for that, that is not correct. Nope. It's out here. I'll give you a hint. It's a South American animal. We don't have them in North America. If you don't know, I'm going to tell you. It's this critter here. This is called a capybara. The crazy thing with this is a quote-unquote rodent, but this rodent can grow up to be about 150 pounds. So it's like it's kind of like a giant woodchuck, but they're one of the main food staples of critters like jaguars down in South America. They love feeding on these capybaras. And Stephanie taught me something earlier today, that these animals will only go to the bathroom when primarily only go to the bathroom when they're standing in water. So that's why you don't drink the water without filtering it whenever you're out in the wild. So, okay. Like I said, for the most part, we're going to be talking about this critter here for the next 40 minutes or so, which is the North American beaver. So that is my cue to begin talking about the biology of this critter. Now, I hate using technical terms, but we're gonna. the first thing I want to tell you is that when we're talking about beavers, there's actually two species of beavers that live in the world today. There's the North American beaver, which we're going to be talking about primarily, but there's also this Eurasian beaver. Now, I'm going to teach you a word. I hate using technical terms, but I think it's great to teach some pretty simple terms one at a time so you can remember those. Oftentimes, we all know what extinct species are. Those are species that no longer exist. And so when we're talking about beavers, if someone mentions beavers, we're talking about a term called extant species. These are species that still exist. They're still present on the landscape. So the two extant species of beavers in the world is the North American beaver and the Eurasian beaver. Although they look very, very much alike and have like tremendously similar characteristics, they're definitely different species. In fact, they can't get them to reproduce because the Eurasian beaver, I think, has 48 chromosomes. The North American only has 40. So that is what literally differentiates species, is the ability to reproduce and produce viable offspring. So if you introduce a Eurasian beaver to North America, to a North American beaver, they may get busy, but they're not going to produce any viable offspring. And so the two extant, or the two existing species of beavers in the world, are the North American and Eurasian. But for this entire talk, we're going to be talking about the North American beaver. And so that's this guy right here. Now the description, again, very similar to the Eurasian beaver. The North American beaver, when you're trying to describe it, coloration, there's only so many ways you can describe the color brown. Light brown, dark brown, really light brown. For the most part, they're brown. Occasionally they get so dark brown that in poor lighting they'll almost look black. But for the most part, they're brown. They have this wonderful fur. In fact, I'll talk a little bit more about their fur and their adaptation there. But the size of the beavers, typically in North America, beaver will grow up, these adult beavers will grow up to weigh anywhere between 30 to 60 pounds. There are some really big beavers that will get to be about 60 pounds. That's a pretty big rodent, remember. That's in the family Rodentia. And so another really interesting thing about the size of beavers is there is an extinct species of beaver called the giant beaver. There's fossil records all over North America and even in Eurasia of this huge category of extinct beavers that were giant, so to speak. And so to put things in perspective, if we look at the typical size nowadays, you're looking at this modern beaver, this North American beaver, again, 30, 40 pounds typically. They could get a little bit bigger than that. Then we have Justin Bieber there. He's about a 6-foot tall man. I liked how they even have the hair swoop on that one. But to give you an idea of this giant beaver, this fossil that they have discovered in so many places, is almost 6 feet tall, and it could weigh in excess of 200 pounds. So the thing I love about that silhouette is they gave the giant beaver jazz hands as well. But anyway, that goes to show this extinct beaver was really nothing you wanted to mess with. I told you about a modern beaver actually attacked someone. I'm sure a giant beaver could do some damage. So these animals were obviously hunted for food, hunted for their furs. Tremendous uses for these animals in the evolution of man and mankind. But enough about the giant beaver. No more beaver jokes, I swear. A really cool thing about beavers, for the most part, they're pretty simple to ID from a tracking position, since they do inhabit mostly aquatic areas, riparian areas where there's likely to be a lot of mud. Their tracks are really easy to see. They have those distinct 5-toed claws on the front feet, but their back feet are much, much larger, and obviously you can see the webbing. And oftentimes in that track you can see the webbing. If anyone, Stephanie included, and any of the students out there, if you could tell me what that third drawing is on the right, I have been trying to figure that out. I didn't know if that was a male-female thing, but I am totally clueless on what that was supposed to be. And surely, yes, it's just the back feet that are webbed. I don't know. I will have a picture of those later on, though. All right, I promise I won't joke. I won't joke around anymore. I think. Well, I got to joke around here. The other big distinguishing feature, obviously, with a beaver. Now, just so you know, there are other critters that look very, very similar to beavers body-wise. That big brown body, kind of like a giant rodent. You have beavers in North America. You also have muskrats, a little bit smaller. You also have in the southern parts of the country, they're non-native, but they're called nutria. Nutria and muskrats look very similar. Like they literally look like small beavers. The big difference between the muskrat and the nutria and the beaver, obviously, is the tail. That is what literally everybody knows when they're talking about. When we're talking about beavers, they have this big flat paddle as a tail. Very, very functional. It looks like he's using it as a surfboard, but it's actually used primarily for propulsion in the water. They do spend most of their life in the water, cutting trees, swimming, building dams. We'll get to all of that. But the tail is very, very useful. One of the really cool things, and I've witnessed this in real life, the tail is also used as a warning device. And I was going to try to insert a video, but I'm still having issues with my videos. If a beaver is swimming in a pond and there is some type of danger that is detected, what the beaver will do is take his tail, and if you've ever been canoeing and you take your oar and you swat it on the water flat, it makes a huge echoing noise. The beaver does exactly that with its tail. It'll slap its tail on the water nice and flat, and that sends a warning to all the other beavers. It's really loud, but the reverberation has warned all the other beavers in that pond. So I see Greg has your hand raised. Do you have a question, Greg? Maybe not. If you do have a question, just go ahead and type it in, and if we could incorporate it, we will. No problem about the hand raise. Okay, more about the biology of beavers. All right, this is really interesting about the diet of beavers. And this is actually, I learned something. Every talk, especially if I don't really specialize in that particular animal, I do a lot of research prior to the discussion. And many of the places that I was researching the diets of these beavers would talk about fish. There's a lot of people that think if a beaver moves in, dams it up, creates this pond, the beaver's going to eat all the fish. Well, at first that's a giant no. They're not primarily fish eaters. They don't eat a lot of fish. However, I was talking with a gentleman from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service just last night, and he sent me 2 papers that were recently published that looked at some of the diets, and they did find that within the beaver's diet, they would occasionally eat salmon and, believe it or not, baby ducks. And so there's this meat component in there. Now, we don't believe that the beavers are actually hunting these animals and going after them. We believe this is more of an opportunistic thing, kind of like a bear that stumbles upon something and can eat it. He's going to eat it. And that's probably how fish and other meat items end up in the beaver's diet. But for the most part, a beaver's diet is pretty consistent. Get rid of the fish and add vegetation. So some of the primary trees that they love aspen, especially in the western states. They love willow. If you know anything about aspen and willow and cottonwood, they're what we call riparian trees. They like this wet environment. So they grow along stream sides, they grow along the edges of lakes. And the beavers are primarily feeding on the vegetation, this soft woody material. Now, when they cut down a tree, a lot of times they're using those branches as dam items when they're constructing their lodges. But one of the main sources of their diet is that innermost layer of the bark. It's called the cambium. That's pretty much the live layer. The beavers will strip that off, store it. That's what they're going to be eating throughout the wintertime. They also put lots of the marsh vegetation in their lodge. And so they're mostly eating vegetation. And so that's pretty much the diet of a beaver. They're primarily vegetarian, but they will scavenge some food items, some meat food items if they come across them. So I mentioned they cut down trees. Everyone knows that's probably the most indicative part of a beaver. Everyone knows that beavers cut down trees to create their lodges, create the dams that they build. And so that brings us to a really cool aspect of their biology. So with that necessity to be able to chew and cut down a tree, you've got to have an adaptation that allows you to do that. So if you notice here, their teeth, I'm going to show a bunch of slides, or you'll probably see a bunch of slides. Their teeth are very, very orange. That's really indicative of the beavers. The thing with their teeth is they're constantly growing. Reason being, gnawing through a tree is pretty tough work. Some of these trees, you know how, imagine trying to cut down a tree with a butter knife. It's gonna take a long, long time. And so their teeth can get worn down really quickly, especially if it's one of the harder species of trees. So fortunately for beavers, their teeth never stop growing. In fact, that's indicative of many of the species of rodentia, because they're always gnawing these really hard food items. And so their teeth actually never stop growing. And as you can see, there's a really good picture of the orange looking teeth of those beavers. But they do quick work on a tree, given the fact that they're just chewing it from the outside. Very indicative wear pattern on the tree. You'll see it's kind of like the typical axe pattern, where it's wide and gets skinnier and skinnier because they're just chewing it down, waiting for that tree to fall. And hopefully, I don't know how much it's been studied, but they're pretty good at dropping a tree where it needs to be, and they want to get many of those limbs in or near the water, as close to the water as possible, so they can begin pruning that tree, taking those branches and using it for their construction items. All right, behavior-wise, and this is where a lot of people will become fan of beavers, because they're awesome. They're awesome parents. They have awesome family units. And so when you're looking at a family unit, typically when you encounter a beaver dam, beaver lodge, it's going to consist of the mother, the father, and their offspring. They might have an extended family that sticks around, especially if it's a big waterway area that can accommodate more beavers. But the cool thing with beavers, they're monogamous. The male and female will mate, and they're going to mate for life. Now, if something happens to a mate, they're not going to dress in black and just mourn their whole life. They're going to find another mate, but for the most part, as long as their mate is still alive, they stick with that mate. Another cool thing, which is rare in lots of species, is there's shared rearing. And so the mother beaver and the father beaver take part in the parental caring of that offspring. And so for the most part, when the mother is nursing on those young kits, which usually wean in about 4 to 6 weeks, she will stay in the den nursing those kits, while the male beaver will be out there bringing food to her and taking care of it that way. Once they're weaned, there's still a lot of training to do, and both the mother and the father will take care of those training tasks. I did mention the kits. They're usually born, the mating season for beavers usually occurs around January or February, and those kits are born generally April to June. I've done a webinar in the past last year that was called Springtime Bounty. Maybe it was this year, I lose track of time. But it's just about how most wild animals try to drop their offspring when the food resources are most plentiful. And so springtime is the time when babies are born. Beavers are no different. So they're dropping their kits. April to June, there's going to be lots of new lush vegetation around the stream side, and they should have no problem feeding their family at that time of the year. I mentioned the mating season occurs January to February, which some people may have thought, in fact, in the very, very beginning, I wasn't even sure whether or not beavers hibernate. They don't. They construct their lodges. Their lodges are pretty thermodynamic. They keep the beavers warm. They store food. So those beavers, sure, they'll sleep a lot, but they're also not going into any type of hibernation mode, any type of torpor like bears are doing. And so that was pretty interesting to find out that beavers don't actually hibernate, because they seem like they would be a good animal to do that. And last but not least, before I turn it over to Stephanie, I'm going to talk a little bit about some interesting facts. Because every time I'm doing research on these new animal topics, I find some really cool stuff. So, first and foremost, beavers are hugely, hugely important to humans and to human cultures. In North America, especially when prior to European settlers coming to North America, many of the Indian cultures relied on beaver pelts, tremendously warm fur. That's one of the neatest adaptations to beavers is their fur is extremely valuable because it's extremely warm and waterproof. But even after the European settlers came here, the beaver pelt trade really fueled this country for probably over 100 years, especially in Canada. I forget what they're called, but gosh darn it, it's on the tip of my tongue. But the frontiers, the Canadian settlers really made their living off hunting beaver pelts all throughout North America. And like I said, that didn't change. That continued even after the European settlers came here. Beaver pelts were a huge, huge commodity in settling this country. All right, Stephanie kind of mentioned it, but there's a really cool thing called castoreum, which comes from those are castor glands from beavers. So that's not like a bunch of really upset male beavers that you see pictured there. What castor is, these glands that the beavers have, they secrete this substance. It's oily, it smells weird, but it is extremely useful. There's so many different uses for this castoreum, from medicines like in way back when, literally as a spice. But one of the most interesting things that's still used today is it's oftentimes used in perfumes. I don't know the exact use. I think it's to create a specific consistency within the perfume. But lo and behold, you didn't realize that beavers have this gland that produces this substance that is used for so many different purposes, literally throughout the ages. And it's still being used today. So the castor glands that produce this castoreum is still a hot commodity, and many beavers are still sold to this day for use of those castor glands. Dana, I don't know if the taste is like vanilla, but when I was reading about it a couple of days ago, it is definitely used not as frequently as vanilla, but there are some cultural recipes that would call for castor or castoreum from the castor glands. And so I haven't brought myself up to taste it. I don't even know where I'd buy it, but I do know that it's used quite a bit in the perfume world. Okay, I mentioned waterproofing. Their fur is phenomenal. Extremely warm fur. The other cool thing is it's waterproof. Whenever you see animals that are in and around water quite a bit, they're constantly grooming themselves. They're constantly removing hair that is fallen out, that's loose. So they're very, very clean animals. And their fur keeps them extremely warm, and it's very, very waterproof. It sheds water. But this is what I mean by the waterproofing. And this was some of the new stuff I learned. Their nostrils will close up. They'll seal their nostrils up when they submerge. They have what's called a nictitating eye membrane. It's literally like a third eyelid that will close, but it's see-through. So they literally have goggles on when they go underwater. But the coolest of cool adaptation to this underwater world that they live in is this waterproofing. So y'all know that they use sticks and lots of other debris to build their dams. And they carry those sticks oftentimes in their teeth. They can actually carry those sticks with their teeth and close their lips behind their teeth. This is the best picture I can show for it, but it will literally form a watertight seal. They'll have these branches in their mouth being held by their teeth, but their mouth will be closed up perfectly so it forms a watertight seal. So I thought this was one of the coolest things I found out about beavers, is how gosh darn cool waterproof they are, from the nictitating eye membrane to the fur to that paddle of a tail to this crazy cool mouth that allows them to close their mouth with their teeth still sticking out. So thought that was really cool. And then last but not least, we're going to talk about parachuting beavers. Believe it or not, I had to laugh at this when I was reading it, but there was a project, 1940s, I think it was Idaho Fish and Game, were trying to relocate beavers in some parts of their state where they've been trapped out. Didn't know how to get there easily transporting beavers, and so someone came up with the idea of these excess World War II parachutes, and so they parachuted, I think it was 94 beavers into the backcountry of Idaho, and every single one except one worked successfully. So it was programmed so the box hits, springs open a latch, and the beavers come out. And so that's how they restocked beavers in Idaho in the 1940s. I swear I'm not making that up. You could Google that. So, yeah, I guess that would be key. They had to make sure that they didn't drop the parachutes in the water, because those boxes would trigger to open up. But that is a true story. So with that really, really cool story, I'm going to see if Stephanie can top us. So I'm done for the biology. Before we go on to Stephanie's part, does anyone have any questions about the biology of beavers? I see Lori typing something. So I'm going to take a quick drink. Is there any advantage to the 5-digit? It seems like a lot of animals have that. I don't want to make anything up to say whether or not the 5 digits. Oftentimes, though, that 5-digit, for example, there's a number of different groups of animals that have 5 digits. For example, bears have 5 digits, raccoons have 5 digits. It appears those creatures that have the 5-digit, especially the front paws, it allows them to grasp things better. Obviously, they don't have opposable thumbs like humans and chimpanzees, but those 5 digits, when you think of raccoons, you think of beavers, having those digits, they can really grab onto things. And so in their world, especially in that beaver world, when they're utilizing sticks to construct their lodges, which Stephanie will talk about, to be a little bit more dexterous with their front feet and their hind feet definitely has an advantage for them. Obviously, you have these hooved animals. They have no dexterity whatsoever. So those 5 digits definitely play a key role in the way they live their life. So being able to grab things and pack things in and do things like that, the 5 digits definitely does help. Thanks for answering that. Let me go back. Yeah, one of the big things with beaver tails, a lot of times that was, besides the fur, it was the fur and the tail that was like the prized possession. And Stephanie mentioned the fat layers in there, the oils that can be pulled out of there. But those castor glands were also extremely, extremely important for the traders. Trish, also known as Puck, asked about the pattern on the tail, unique to each. I agree with Stephanie. I don't know. I would imagine it would be very hard. Think of it like a snake skin. There's just so much texture to it. I imagine that there's going to be individualization of that, but whether or not it's so unique like that that you could use it as a fingerprint would be doubtful. It's just their outer covering, and it's texturized, but I don't think it's unique specifically to each beaver. Okay, I think I'm going to shut up for a little while, take a drink, and turn the rest of this over to Stephanie.
Which, just for the record, is not very fair because that was really funny and I can't follow that up. That was probably the funniest presentation I've ever seen you give. So, on that note, I will be the boring person to talk about what ecosystem engineers are and really kind of delve into how beavers actually affect the entire, yeah, I know, didn't you? But how they affect their entire environment. So, with that, I guess the first thing that we should probably do is talk about what an ecosystem engineer actually is, what qualifies an organism to be an ecosystem engineer. So, pretty much, this is any organism that actually creates a significant impact on the environment that they immediately live in. That could be modifying that impact, modifying that environment. It could be destroying it, just altering it based on their presence. So, um, boiling it down, it's just they physically alter the actual landscape in which they live in. And they have a huge impact on all of the species and the biodiversity that actually is in that area because of that. So, as a result, ecosystem engineers are important for maintaining health and stability of specific environments that they're living in. And I say that specific environment they're living in, but mostly it's the environment that they're instrumental in creating. Because once they've helped to create that environment, it's really on them to maintain that environment. So, all organisms, you may not know, every single organism actually has some sort of an impact on the environment where they live in one way or another. Most of it is it's really tiny things that a lot of people wouldn't notice if they were studying that kind of thing. So it's been proposed that we actually hold the term ecosystem engineer for species that we call keystone species. And that's generally a species where the behavior strongly affects other organisms that are around. A lot of people will usually add in also that the impact of that species is much broader than what the size of that species may actually lead you to believe. So no, surely the ecosystem engineer isn't the same as a keystone species. The keystone species may just be something that because it's in an environment, it has kind of an umbrella effect on other things around it, whether it's keeping populations in check or influencing the behavior of other animals. But in the ecosystem engineer case, they're literally engineering the environment where they live. So they are physically changing the environment to suit their needs. So it's a little bit distinct there, but they do make sure that if you're an ecosystem engineer, you do also need to be a keystone species. You're welcome. So, how does the beaver actually qualify? And I have no cool things like what Daryl had, but we'll take a look at this little guy's professional endorsements. So, we all know that the beaver is an absolute lumberjack extraordinaire. It's really what they're very well known for is how well they can cut down trees. But it doesn't actually just stop at cutting down trees. They actually are really good at land clearing in general. They do a thing called girdling of trees where they're going to just kind of strip that outer layer of bark off, and that can essentially kill the tree as well. In addition to that, after they've really started to modify the land that they live in, when that land starts to backfill with water and flood, a lot of the tree species, actually most of them, can't tolerate that kind of an environment because the root system actually requires the ability to get air. So when they backflood that, it quite literally will just clear the land. So they're clearing it either by cutting down trees, girdling the trees, or just kind of flooding the trees out. So another qualification that they have, I call this the roads and rec. So one of the things that people don't realize is that yeah, we all know that they create ponds, these big beaver impoundment ponds. But in addition to that, they actually create these little canal systems that go through. So it's kind of like their roads. It's their version of a road. And they also create, because of the land clearing around their impoundment or their pond, they actually create a lot of what we call in the field, we call it successional habitat. So it's that habitat after the trees and everything have been removed. It's that first growth of things that start coming up that normally wouldn't be able to grow there because of the trees absorbing all of the sunlight, for example. Of course, we all know that they are architects extraordinaire. They do build lodges and dams, and they're just little Bob the Builders. They make burrows, and they are absolutely fantastic at doing those things. So if we take just those four little things there and look at all of the impacts that that has on the environment around the beaver, it's pretty easy to see that he actually does qualify as both a keystone species because of his major change on the landscape, but also as an ecological engineer because he has quite literally made that landscape that's around him. So I guess the first thing we'll talk about is dams. Dams are, again, they're probably the most common thing that we think of whenever we're thinking about a beaver. So dam building, just to give you a quick insight into that, it's the most intense during the spring and fall period, but they will actually continue construction activities at other times of the year depending on the need. Beaver dams are usually built on streams that are less than 20 feet across and about 3 to 4 feet deep. That's the initial stream that they're looking at damming up. And they are continually adding new material to that structure over the years because as that impoundment, that dam starts making that pond behind it, which is called an impoundment, as that impoundment grows, they have to continually build onto that dam to make the dam kind of fit and continue to keep the water maintained where they like it. So when they're building this dam, what they actually do is they take a lot of wood and stones and they bind them together with their hands. They do not use their tails to slap it into place like we used to see on cartoons. Um, and they really tightly compact this. So this is not something that's kind of a shoddy um, thing that's going to fall apart in a few days if they're not maintaining it. It's literally this really tight, compact, well structured dam that they're using to kind of keep all of this. Yeah, it is. Shirley mentioned that it's like the Adobe houses, and it's very much like that. It's extremely tolerant of that environment, and it's very good at staying in place. So, as a sidebar, and my one of my neat little tidbits that I put in here, the longest beaver dam that's on record, and there is a difference between the largest and the longest, just for the record. But the longest beaver dam was almost 2,800 feet long, and it's located in Alberta. And they actually, you can, it's not easy to see if you don't know exactly what you're looking for, but you can actually see it on Google Earth if you can find that area um, there at the Wood Buffalo National Park, and you can scroll in. And instead of actually looking for the dam, if you do decide to take a wild hair and see if you can do what I said you can do, you actually just have to look for an area in the woods where, in the middle of this forest, there's just this massive clearing where the woods are no longer there, and you can see this huge um, lake environment, and you can actually see the Beaver Dam like just literally spanning all across the first half of it, where it's backing that up. So let's see what's next that we're going to talk about. So the cool thing about where the beavers actually are building their lodges and what the point of that entire pond that they're making is they're actually using it like it's a little moat. So they're they're building this thing around them, and they're backing up this water so that the area that they're going to build their house in and raise their families in, it's like quite literally like a little moat. It's going to protect them from a lot of those terrestrial predators, and it keeps them very safe across their landscape. So the bigger the moat, the safer the area. So it also kind of as a sidebar on that, and I'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about some of the canal building. But the bigger that pond is, they can actually travel further via water because it's easier for them to travel in water to get to new spots to either add substance to their dams, their lodges, or even just as a food source. So, okay, in which we've got this little circle here. So again, increase the wall size. That's their dam. It provides predator protection because it's expanding out their moat and it gives them wider access to the environment around them. So next we've got burrows and lodges. Burrows are actually an area of the bank that they use to hollow out. Um, this is not a great example, but it's the water's down here, so you can actually see it. But generally speaking, a burrow is a tunnel or a maze of tunnels that go into a chamber or one or more chambers. And more often than not, they actually use these kind of land-based burrows to to stay in and raise their families than they do in actual lodges. So while the lodges are cool and we really think of beavers and we put them in context with the lodge, burrows are far more common. And the reason why I say this is a bad example is because generally speaking, they're going to build the entrance to that burrow in an underwater area, but the living quarters in there are always going to be above a water level. So they can go in underwater so they don't have to go out and across land and essentially get potential for predator involvement. They can just go in when they're swimming underwater and then go into their house. And then at lodges, you can see the lodge looks a lot like what I've just described with the burrow. The big difference here is that the lodge is built pretty much out in the middle of the water. So this is their castle in the middle of their moat. Again, they put those entrances at the under the water level, but the living area is always going to be above the water level. Another cool thing about these beaver lodges is sometimes birds, for example, will make their nest on top of it because it's a really safe place for them to stay too. It keeps them safe from those terrestrial predators that may be around. And whether it's a burrow or a lodge, they generally are going to have more than one entry or exit. That way, if something happens to one entryway, they've got a backup system that they can go to. So let's see, what do we got next? So canals. These again, they're kind of the roads that they use. And of all of the things that a beaver can build, these are probably the least impressive, to be honest with you. So what the beavers do is they actually will just go through the mud and they'll use their feet and their hands to push that mud out of the way. And essentially, they're going to be building a little canal system. And they use that canal system for lots of things. They use it to travel between impoundment areas because it's easier for them, again, to go through the water because they are an aquatic mammal or a semi aquatic mammal. But they also use it to help, like Daryl mentioned earlier, if they fell a tree, it's a lot easier to haul that tree when it's at least semi floating than it is to drag it across all of that land. So in this image we've got here, you can see that they've actually got a tree that they've begun felling, and it's right next to this canal system. So that'll help them get it to their back to their either their lodge, their burrow, or their dam. So Daryl kind of hinted at this earlier, but one of the nifty things about when beavers are actually chewing down these trees, they'll oftentimes chew them to almost the point where it's going to fall, but they don't want to get crushed. Some beavers, it's not very common, but beavers do get crushed by trees if they've overestimated how much they've cut or if the wind is going the wrong direction. But a lot of times they'll cut this and try to get it in the manner so it will fall in the direction they want, but they'll actually wait for the wind to do the rest of that work for them. That way they're out of the way and they don't have to worry about kind of fallout from that. Oh, let's see. So we do talk about how these guys are ecosystem engineers, but we have to remember that what's good for one species is not necessarily good for another species. So these guys are coming onto this territory and they're quite literally changing the entire landscape. They're taking it from that riparian landscape that Daryl mentioned, which is streams, kind of just um, the typical forest stream or wide brook or even a small river, those types of areas, and they're backing it up. They're changing the entire landscape across there. It's the equivalent of the Army Corps of Engineers or Tennessee Valley Authority going to a small but pretty fast moving river, building a dam there, and it backfilling up for miles and miles and miles. It's very much the same, just on a beaver's scale. So there's a lot of things that like that environment whenever they've rebuilt it, but there's a lot of things also that maybe don't like that environment as much. So we're going to talk kind of about that double standard because we do tend to just look at the benefits. So this way we can kind of get kind of an even snapshot on what's going on both sides of the fence. So one of the first things that we're going to talk about are birds and the effects that beavers actually have on bird life. And these are going to be mostly examples, but we'll talk about beneficial effects for like waterfowl, herons, upland game birds, pileated woodpeckers, kingfishers, some of the accipiters or an osprey, barn swallows, and red-breasted nuthatch. These are examples, and it's a pretty good list to give us an idea of how many birds actually benefit from them the beaver changing and modifying this environment from kind of a stream-based environment to more of a lake environment. There are a lot of different, the waterfowl is kind of a gimme on that one, honestly, the herons as well. But there are a lot of other species that you will find a lot more in a beaver impoundment area than you would find in a similar environment that's not a beaver impoundment area. But again, on the flip side of that, there are other animals where it either has a neutral or an adverse effect on them, where they don't like that area as much. So if they were there, they're going to back up and leave. An example of that is the white-breasted nuthatch, which prefers just the main forest area, and the brown creeper, which is kind of a similar story there. So when we're talking about amphibians, it's a little easier. We're just going to kind of lump these into two. So as a rule of thumb, frogs are about twice as abundant in a beaver impoundment as in the prior environment was there. But on the flip side of that, salamanders are 10 times more abundant in those stream environments where they've not been backfilled and that impoundment has not been created by those beavers. So well, that's a general rule of thumb, of course. It doesn't always hold water, so that's my one lame attempt at humor. Thank you, Daryl, for shaking your head at me. But that is one of the things that we can kind of just generalize. So it's again, it's not across the board where every single frog is going to be twice abundant. And for example, toads, which a lot of people lump into the frog bit, um, the toads actually don't like. Well, they're kind of neutral. They don't care one way or another, but generally you'll find them more in the stream environments before the beaver has shown up. So when we're looking at, let's see, reptiles, the beneficial effects, a lot of times you're going to see an increase in lizards, and that includes skanks. Turtles is another kind of a gimme that you would expect to see their populations increasing, or their preferences, I should say, being in those beaver impoundment areas, but that does actually exclude the eastern box turtle, who you can see on the right. He doesn't care either way. The eastern box turtle could care less if there's a beaver impoundment or if there's a stream. He's happy either way. The northern brown snake also does have some beneficial effects from that impoundment, where we see increases in their population. A lot of people probably don't really care about the bottom two on the right, but that's a shame. So the southern ringneck snake and the worm snake are also things that are adversely affected by these beaver impoundments. So you won't find them as much there as you would in an area where the beaver didn't create that dam in that area. And I know, like I just mentioned, that I think it's a shame, but you have to keep in mind that these reptiles, specifically snakes, are just absolutely vital to keeping an area healthy and keeping them from being overrun by lots of other things. So they're great to keep on your landscape or in your yard, just for the record. All right, so invertebrates. So when we talk about invertebrates, we're talking about the bug world. So with bugs, you see, and this is another gimme, predaceous dragonflies, they love water. And the more things that hang out by water, the more they're going to be around, because these guys like to eat other insects. So if you see all those little midges or gnats, you'll see this dragonfly zipping through that environment, and he's just absolutely having a smorgasbord and eating all of those gnats and small flies and things. So when you've got a big impoundment of water, generally you'll see a lot of increase in some types of invertebrate species, and that brings in those predaceous dragonflies. On the flip side of that, black flies and scraping mayflies are examples of invertebrates that you're not going to find as much, which black flies, that almost makes me want to move to a beaver impoundment. But sadly, there are so many invertebrates, and it's really, really tough for us to qualify on those, which ones preferred these beaver impoundment areas, which ones prefer the stream areas. The sad thing is most of them can adapt really quickly, and the mosquito is a great example of one of those, that it doesn't matter what the environment is, it seems like those little buggers can just adapt and they will always be around. All right, and on our last one, let's talk about trees. So it's probably pretty obvious that trees are not going to be great big fans of beavers, because they're the beavers' food source, they're the beavers' materials that they use to make lodges, burrows, um, dams. I mean, if you're a tree and you see a beaver coming, if you could get up and run, that's probably the thing that you would want to do. But trees, obviously, they're not going to have the ability to do that. So while in certain areas, like if we're starting to back flood, and those trees are going to just die out because their roots can't get to any air, excuse me, or they can't get to any air, don't feel too terrible for the trees because the trees that the beavers prefer to cut down, like Daryl said, there's aspen, there's willow, there's cottonwood. A lot of these trees, they'll start to regrow or rebud from either the root system or the stump that's left. But the really nifty thing is when that little tree starts to sprout again, they build up this chemical that we call tannins. And that tannin, that chemical, is actually toxic to beavers. So if that beaver chews down that tree, when that tree starts to regrow, it's quite literally having a bit of a chemical warfare on the beaver because it's going to produce more things that are going to actually try to kill that beaver if that beaver tries to eat that tree again. It's not always a one-off right away type of thing, but they do have their own defense mechanisms that they have developed over the eons. All right, and let's see, what do we have next? So I did mention that these are very, very sturdy, very solid structures when we're talking about beaver dams, but they do eventually break down. That pond is going to slowly start to drain. And when it drains, it's actually really changing the environment where it was because that soil where the pond was has all of this sediment in it and it's got all of the material and the detritus from things that have fallen in, died, whatever. And that's all settled onto this now essentially new soil because now it's topsoil. And it's really, really nutrient rich and it provides this absolute springboard for new growth to start. So the other cool thing, again, the lack of trees, it's not always a bad thing because when you have all of these trees and this heavy tree canopy that's already in place, it prevents a lot of that light from getting to the actual ground level. So when they've got this open wide space, there's a lot of light penetration. The soil moisture is a lot higher because it was a pond prior to this, and still has some of the natural stream levels, water levels going through there. But it's just really providing this brand new fresh environment, and we actually call these beaver meadows when you see them. So when you're walking through the woods next time and you come across this for no good reason, giant, beautiful meadow, and you see a lot of these dead trees kind of laying around, it might be something where you can now look around and say, hey, this might actually be a beaver meadow that I'm looking at. And then, so we mentioned earlier, it's not the size that matters, but it's kind of actually the reverse of that is true. A beaver is so much smaller than a moose or a bear, but it has such a huge impact on its environment. They're the only animals besides humans that can actually cut down a mature tree, which is pretty cool. They do concentrate. That wasn't a mushroom, Gerald. That was a little beaver that swam across. But the beavers concentrate their tree felling in a very narrow area surrounding their pond so that they can, of course, use that wood and not haul it further. But it creates this kind of banking area around their impoundment. And they actually remove so much more vegetation than they could ever think of consuming because they use that vegetation for everything, for housing, for the dams, for all of their food source. So they use it for quite a bit of things. So when it comes to them being an ecological engineer, they are just absolutely the most incredible species that I can think of on the planet. So with that, I am going to politely turn it back to
That
Daryl.
was awesome, Steph. Does anyone have any questions about the beaver's role in the environment and what they can do to the landscape or their association with any of those other animals that they impact?
So Shirley actually has a question about the bats or the swallows that might benefit. And that's kind of interesting because there are, for example, with the bats specifically, there are some species of bats, and you know more about this, Daryl, than I do, but that are good at living in a forest. But we all know that bats use echolocation and use sound to be able to identify their prey. And a lot of times when they're in an area over a pond, it just provides that easier environment for them to be able to do their crazy acrobatics that they do mid-air. So I would think that bats would be more prone to being above a beaver impoundment, but I can't tell you that I've got any scientific proof on that.
I'll let you get Lori's question too.
Okay, I can do that one. So they don't chew one side and then another. They actually do work their way around the tree, which is why they come up with that conical kind of like a an hourglass figure left in that tree because they'll start and they'll just work their way in and around as they're going. So yeah, they'll actually chew all the way around. They'll leave it to, again, where it's just enough to keep that tree um, standing, and they'll have a little more built or taken out so that when the wind blows, hopefully it'll blow the right direction and the tree will fall in the intended direction where they wanted to fell it. Okay, so it looks like Trish actually asked a question about when they're felling trees and building lodges, is it one family effort or a community effort? They do have, I think they do have some communities that they live in, but they don't normally live in the same lodge, I don't think. But I can't tell you that I know
Yeah,
that one. Daryl, I'm going to
the individual
pass that on to
lodges
you.
are usually reserved for immediate family. So mother, father, offspring. One of the things that I found interesting is, and I forget the technical term for it, but if if the mother or father, if one of the adult beaver passes away, oftentimes if there is like an older sibling to pick up the slack, they'll do that, and then they more or less inherit the lodge. But for the most part, when it becomes too crowded in there, those young offspring pretty much go out to establish their own territory. And there's definitely territories set up for beavers. If the water body is large enough that it could accommodate a few different lodges, that's tolerable. But oftentimes they're building on small streams, and there's just not enough trees, not enough water. And so, believe it or not, beavers will travel quite a distance to establish new territories. They want to find a fresh supply of trees, fresh supply of water, and so they'll travel quite a bit to establish a new territory. And there was a question from Bet about how long do they live, and that's more on the biological side. Um, in my research, there is one instance where a beaver in captivity lived to be 24 years old. That was the longest known beaver. Typically, adults in the wild, life in the wild is much, much harder because they're dealing with predation, they're dealing with drought, they're dealing with all these other issues. And so think about the lifespan being about half. Anywhere from 10 years to 15 years would be a fairly old adult beaver. But they're relatively long-lived in the rodent family. Usually mice and rats are usually just a few years, but beavers can live to be well over 10 years. Trish asked a question about pond freezing. Uh, I'm guessing they stay in the lodge and wait for the break in the weather and ice. Yeah, the cool thing is they remember when Stephanie was describing the lodge, she had a great photo of it. The lodge area is actually built above water level. And so because it's not airtight, they'll still have air, they'll still have everything they need. They store a ton of their food underwater. They'll pack in these tree branches with lots of vegetation still on it. And so in the wintertime, they're awake. They do spend a lot of downtime in the wintertime. But whenever they get hungry, they just swim down to where the water's free. Their opening to the lodge is never going to, would probably never freeze up. It's so far below the surface. And so they can go down just like fish live under the ice throughout the wintertime. A beaver could go down there, get a fresh supply of food, bring it up into their lodge. And so the freezing of the lake or whatever water body that they created usually is not much problem in the wintertime. Another question about the lodge. Is their lodge tidy? From a rodent standpoint, I would say it's pretty tidy. Usually whenever an animal creates some type of place to live, whether or not it's subterranean or they build this lodge like in beavers, oftentimes mammals will have a separate, you could call it a bathroom area, but it's definitely a place away from where they're sleeping, where they're eating, where they will defecate and urinate. And so from that standpoint, a lot of mammals are clean in that regard. They don't, even like look at a bird's nest, you can get, there's some pretty nasty bird nests actually, but for the most part, they try going over the edge. Sometimes they don't make it, but they try not to to contaminate their bedding area, their feeding area as much as possible. Okay, I'm gonna breeze through and finish this up because I did want to throw something in. I know some of you might have to get going, but here is a picture. I got to tell you about this because I think this is one of the coolest things. This is a picture of the Rio Cebolla. It is, believe it or not, they call that a river here in the West. But that is the Rio Cebolla River in the Santa Fe National Forest. You look at that river, and does that look healthy or unhealthy? I'll tell you right away, that is not a very good looking river. No, that's not me on the bike. That river, you could see how narrow and how deep it is. That is a very unhealthy water system. What has happened over the hundreds of years, you know that there's lots of active grazing that goes on in the West, and lots of plants love growing around water. It's usually really rich in vegetation. But because of this grazing that has occurred for hundreds of years, what do animals like to eat? Whether or not it's elk or cows, because there's lots of human habitation in this area and they're allowed to graze on the forest. All these large ungulates will eat the really healthy, lush vegetation that grows around these waterways. And so it denudes, it literally strips all the vegetation away from the rivers. So in the West, instead of having constant rain like you do in the Southeast, you have these flood events where it won't rain for a long time and then you'll get a really intense storm, and it creates these flash floods. And when that occurs and there's no vegetation to slow that water down, it begins carving out a channel. There's so much water rushing through there so fast. You know the power of water is extremely powerful. And so it carves out a deeper and deeper channel, and it gets narrower and narrower. And that's because there's no vegetation growing along the stream side. What are beavers great at creating? They're creating these dams that slow down that river, that create moist soils, that creates more and more lush vegetation. So what we have begun doing the last couple of years are creating what's called beaver dam analogs. We go in there, they're literally imitation beaver dams. We go in there, we set these posts up in there, and then we'll take natural willows from the area and weave it throughout those posts to create an artificial beaver dam. This is that same river, different section of the river, but you can see how narrow it was, especially on the far right, what a narrow channel it was. And shortly after creating that beaver dam analog, that fake beaver dam, you could see where the water's backing up and creating a deeper pond. We've installed, I think, over 30 of these along this Rio Cebolla section of the river. And I wish I had pictures to show you the night and day difference of the vegetation that immediately responds when you begin backing up and slowing this water. It creates much more vegetation. But here's the wonderful thing. 2 weeks after creating that first beaver dam, that artificial beaver dam, we went up there and one of the dams was breached. Something poked a hole in it. And what had happened is we annoyed some beaver family way down the forest that we had no idea was even there. And beavers within the first few weeks moved up to say, step aside, son, you don't know what you're doing. And so they started taking over these dams, rebuilding them, doing it the right way, the beaver way. But it's amazing the impact that improves the health of this river, this stream, as most of us would call it. And so we put in these artificial beaver dams. We wait a little while, a beaver comes in, restores them, and before long we have these tremendous wetlands that are lush in vegetation. So much better for flood control because it slows the water down. It doesn't scour the bottom of that stream system. And so that's a really cool thing, and we have the beaver to thank. And so with that, besides thanking the beaver, I want to thank you guys for sticking with us. We went a little over an hour, which is what we typically do. Your questions have been fantastic. If you have any more questions, please start typing away. and hopefully me and Stephanie can get to them. What I'm going to do is do my photo credits. We had to search far and wide to get a lot of our beaver pictures today. Um, but I also wanted to let you know that we have our website. Y'all know the website. Please, 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 we're always reminding, even if you've left comments, tell us how each of the individual classes are, whether or not you do it on our Facebook page. That is the best. If you could provide comments on these classes, that's wonderful. You can also follow us on Twitter. Big shout out to Trish. She does our Twitter page. Mark your calendars. 2 weeks from today is my next class. This is actually kind of a part two. I did teach a class probably about 6-7 months ago about animal tracks. Very basic class, kind of what you look for when you come across animal tracks. You can identify that animal. This one is very similar to that class, but we won't be talking about tracks so much. We're going to be beyond tracks. We're going to be looking at things that animals leave as a signpost for us, and we can tell what kind of animal was there or how big that animal was. This is actually this dugout area was created by elk. I took this picture a few years ago. But we're going to talk about all different things that animals leave behind that, unbeknownst to the average person walking through the woods, they might walk by it and not even realize that there is a large animal that did this not too long ago. So 2 weeks from today, Animal Tracks. Sign up for it if you're not signed up. I think you'll enjoy that. And last but not least, if you have any more questions, we thank you again, myself and Stephanie. Stephanie, you did awesome with your part. I really appreciate you joining in. So, all right. If there's no more questions, you guys rock. So very thankful. Thank you again, Stephanie, for joining in. I might invite you back one day. Trying to see how to pause my recording. Actually, I'm going to be asking Stephanie, we do have, there's going to be a class, one of her specialties is cats, and so we do have a Panthera that's all about the large cats of the world, so hopefully you could help us with that one too, Steph. Do otters. That might be scheduled for next year. Thanks for that suggestion, Dana. Otters, I'll tell you a quick little thing. Otters are a huge success story. Tennessee, obviously I'm familiar with Tennessee, having worked there for so long. Huge success story. Prior to the 70s, there was hardly any otters in Tennessee. We started trapping them and bringing them up from Louisiana. And literally within a few decades, they're pretty much every county, most waterways, most major waterways in Tennessee. So tremendous success story with otters. And those things will wipe out a fish pond. They definitely eat fish. Coolest critter because how playful they are. Huh. You're going to have to tell us about the otter attack.
I won't get the video rolling because I told the family they can get back on the internet. But essentially, boy jumps into pond off of a pier dock type of situation, and 2 otters came into the water from the other side of the pond, swam all the way across it, and then proceeded to attack him in the legs and in back, and his shoulder actually. And it was mostly territorial. I think that they just didn't like him jumping in their pond, but yeah, we actually got called on that one and had there was an investigation. I, for the record, did not support investigating that one, but the person that was called did, so they went.
Awesome. All right, well, thanks again, guys. I think we're going to log out of here. And if you're joining us this Sunday, we've got a freebie bear class that's pretty much full, so you can't register now. But hopefully we're going to get more and more folks chiming in or at least joining us on these wildlife talks. So You guys are awesome, and I appreciate each and every one of you. And if you could leave a comment on Facebook, you have no idea how much we appreciate that. So, thanks everyone.